This Artificial Intelligence and Equality podcast is hosted by Carnegie Council Senior Fellow Wendell Wallach. Together with Anya Casperson and an international advisory board, they direct the Carnegie Artificial Intelligence and Equality Initiative, AIEI, which seeks to understand the innumerable ways in which AI impacts equality and international affairs. This episode features David Chalmers being interviewed by Wendell Wallach. It was recorded on August 9th, 2022.
I'm Wendell Wallach. Thank you all for joining us today. With Dave Chalmers, a leading figure in the philosophy of mind and of technology as our guest, this promises to be a fascinating workshop. We'll be talking with Dave about his latest book, Reality Plus, Virtual Worlds and the Problems of Philosophy. In 1994, while he was still a graduate student at Indiana University, Dave Chalmers attended the very first Tucson conference focused on developing a science of consciousness. And at that conference, he offered a fundamental distinction between the hard problem of explaining consciousness and easier problems that are more likely to yield to scientific investigations. He instantaneously became the rock star of consciousness studies, a role he has upheld with intellectual rigor for almost 3 decades. While Dave continues to be best known for the hard problem, in all modesty, he says the difficulty in explaining consciousness was already well understood. He just provided a term, a label, a useful distinction, or a meme for discussing it. David Chalmers is presently University Professor of Philosophy and Natural Science at New York University, as well as co-director of NYU's Center for Mind, Brain, and Consciousness. His recent book, published in January, Reality Plus, explores a vast array of philosophical questions posed by virtual reality, augmented reality, and the metaverse. These range from the simulation hypothesis, a theory that our universe, the world we live in, might actually be a simulation. And it goes on to much more specific questions that may seem realer for many of us about the nature of the virtual worlds we are creating, whether experiences in them are illusions or must be understood in other ways. Reality Plus is both a textbook and an introduction to philosophy, and therefore accessible to educated readers, but it's also an original work of philosophy. So Dave, throughout Reality Plus, you make the case for virtual realism or simulated realism, that virtual reality is genuine reality. Can you please elucidate for our listeners what you mean by this?
Sure. Well, first, let me say thanks, Wendell, for having me on your podcast. It's really a pleasure to have this chance to talk in depth with you about these issues. So yes, the central slogan of this book is virtual reality is genuine reality, and I take myself to be, contesting what many people take to be common sense about virtual reality. It's very, very common to hear virtual reality is a fake or fictional reality, that it essentially involves illusions or hallucinations. Even people like, the great science fiction authors who've written about virtual reality, Neil Stephenson, William Gibson, talk about virtual reality as an illusion or a hallucination that's not fully real. I want to say that in many core senses, virtual reality is fully real. What happens in virtual reality really happens. Objects in virtual reality really exist. In the extreme case is the case where we consider the hypothesis that we are ourselves in a virtual reality, that we are ourselves living in a simulation. In that case, I want to argue, well, okay, well, it could be that we're in a simulation, but if we are, that doesn't mean that all this is an illusion and that nothing is real. It merely means that we're living in a digital reality, a world where the objects around us, the tables, the chairs, the organisms, the planets are ultimately digital entities, surviving grounded in some kinds of computational processes, perhaps in another universe up. Doesn't mean they're not real. And furthermore, I want to argue this isn't just the case for, the simulation idea is an extreme case used to get at this idea of virtual reality as genuine reality. But I also want to argue the same applies for the virtual worlds that we are in the process of creating. Virtual worlds have already been around for a long time, especially in the video game world, but they're increasingly going to be worlds that we actually interact with and spend, serious parts of our life in, perhaps for work, perhaps for socializing, perhaps for entertainment, perhaps building communities. I want to argue that, what happens in virtual reality is a genuine reality, and that one can live, in principle, a meaningful life in a virtual world. This doesn't mean that life in VR is automatically going to be wonderful or utopian. I just said meaningful. It's quite consistent with this, that it could turn out that life in virtual reality will be awful or dystopian. I'm inclined to, to go for a middle ground here myself and look at the ways in which virtual reality might be good and the ways in which it might be problematic. But in any case, I'm inclined to think, it's meaningful, and we have to take it all the more. We have to take this coming technology all the more seriously, because it is going to be, in a certain sense, creating our reality in which we can live meaningful lives.
So let's unpack that a little bit and start out with the simulation hypothesis, because there have been versions of that well before it was put forward as a simulation process hypothesis when we began to think about virtual worlds. So we have Plato, we have Descartes. They have both suggested that there's something unreal about the world that we live in, or at least its reality should be questioned.
Yeah, in fact, you find, antecedents of this idea in almost all of the, the great ancient traditions of philosophy. For example, in Chinese philosophy, you find the Taoist philosopher Zhuangzi giving his allegory of the butterfly dream, saying, well, I dreamed I was a butterfly flitting about. Now I wake up and find myself here as Zhuangzi. But how do I know that I'm Zhuangzi, who dreamed he was a butterfly? Maybe I'm a butterfly dreaming that I'm Zhuangzi. And that can be seen as a way of raising this age-old idea. How do we know that everything we're experiencing now isn't all a dream? And of course, a dream is in a way an antecedent of the simulation idea. Maybe it's a simulation without a computer, but it's, in some ways can be seen as continuous. In ancient Indian philosophy, we find all kinds of folk tales and philosophical analyses of what they call Maya, or illusion. And, it's often said that the whole world we're experiencing is a kind of illusion. We have folk tales about the god Vishnu coming down and transforming people into new situations. The sage Narada suddenly finds himself living a life as a woman, as a queen of a society, children and grandchildren. Then suddenly the children die, she's weeping, and then Narada finds himself back in front of Vishnu, and Vishnu says, now I've shown you illusion. So this is the idea the world is a giant illusion, another antecedent of the simulation idea. Then in ancient Greek philosophy, we have Plato and his famous allegory of the cave. The prisoners are chained up, looking at shadows on the cave wall, and which is for Plato it's a mere shadow of reality. And Plato is using this to ask us, how do we know that we ourselves are not in a shadow of reality. Many people would see that as all three of these questions as ways of asking the questions about virtual reality, or that we're in a, the question, are we in a simulation, is a recognizable descendant of the thesis that we're in a dream, that we're in an illusion, that we're in a shadow of reality. René Descartes, much later in the 17th century, gave a classic formulation to these questions by saying, how do we know that an evil demon isn't fooling us into thinking all of this is real, when in fact, none of this is real? Many people think that's another question that we can now raise in a technological key by asking the question, how do we know that all this is not a simulation? So this simulation idea is really, although it seems kind of high-tech and new, it's very much a descendant, I think, of these key themes that run through many traditions in the history of philosophy.
We're going to come back to what I think is your position on whether we live in a simulation or not. But before we get to that, I want to underscore this other side of Reality Plus, which is it was also written to be a textbook. And there is this tension in the book itself between the ways in which it functions as a textbook on philosophy, and the fact that you are putting forward original positions, some of which might be quite controversial. But I think our listeners can already get a sense of what kind of a textbook it is. It brings up so many precursor positions, issues, viewpoints of leading philosophers throughout history, and introduces them in their words at the same time as you question their applicability to virtual realities or whether we live in a simulation. And it's that contemporary dimension which gives it a little bit of excitement, a little bit of flavor, a little bit of freshness. As people may notice, you've already referred to a few pieces of science fiction in which this came up. And I think that's the juice behind this book, and I think why many people will find it a good read, even if they're new to philosophy or if they have been engaged in philosophical reflections over the years, that it's this merging of the history of philosophy, the great ideas of so many thinkers, and how the possibilities that are posed by new technologies, in this case, particularly virtual reality, but also artificial intelligence more broadly, repose these questions for us, or put them in a new form, or at least put them in a form where they're less caught up in the classical language and more reflective of things that we think about. Was that your intention? I mean, was this meant to be a textbook? Did you hope that this would be accessible to a broad audience? And how do you view its function as a textbook together with the fact that this really is an original work in philosophy?
Yeah, I guess I wouldn't use the word textbook myself, just because that makes it sound, a little dull and bureaucratic. But I would say I very much intended it as an introduction to philosophy, as a book that someone could read without any formal background in philosophy, and that by reading it, they would get an introduction to many different philosophical ideas and themes from many different traditions and many different areas. I mean, I didn't initially, I think, set out to do that. I mean, most important to me was to write a book that would give my own analysis of philosophical questions, both some very traditional philosophical questions about reality and our knowledge of it, and new philosophical questions about, the coming technology of virtual reality and artificial intelligence. But in thinking about those things, I realized that, this did not actually require complicated technical philosophical jargon to explain the key ideas. The ideas involved here are so fundamental in a way that it's possible to approach them in plain language. That's not always the case in philosophy. Quite a lot of my work is technical, uses jargon for specialists, and I don't apologize for that, because sometimes it's necessary. But I just figured out that I could write this book in a way that didn't require presupposing that background. And that furthermore, the issues here connect to so many of the great traditional areas of philosophy, about knowledge, about value, about God, about consciousness, about ethics, about science, that in a way, in doing this properly and explaining these ideas to somebody without much background, you'd basically be giving them an introduction to philosophy. So at that point, I deliberately set out to write a book that both introduced philosophical ideas and that tried to give my own analysis of a bunch of key themes and argue for my own views, which may in some cases be controversial and opinionated. But I'd like to think people could read the book for either of those things. Some people might put most weight on the introduction to philosophical ideas. Some might put the most weight on my own arguments and viewpoints and engaging with those. But both books are in there.
Yeah, I think you're correct. Introduction is probably a much better word than textbook for what we have here. And if I can say so, I think it's a very entertaining introduction and a very accessible introduction. I think what makes it an introduction is the daunting array of issues you bring up, and therefore the daunting array of classical philosophical ideas, theories, positions that you're able to touch upon as you go through the exploration of these different ideas. So, and I think in that sense, it's a very successful and accessible introduction. But I don't think we should let our listeners believe that there aren't going to be some places where there's a little bit of heavy going, and you do tend to warn readers when it's going to get a little bit more dense. But let's go to two of your fundamental positions. If I read the book correctly, after a great deal of explication, you're pretty clear that we can't know whether or not we live in a simulation and may never be able to know. Did I get that right?
That's about right. I guess there are different versions of the simulation hypothesis. On one version, it's an imperfect simulation where there are glitches and signs that we're in a simulation. If we're in that kind of simulation, it's possible that we could know. Maybe, for example, the creators could reveal themselves to us, show us their powers. They'll move around heavenly body and at the same time show us the source code. They could give us probably, I think, quite good evidence that we are in a simulation. On the other hand, if we're in what people call a perfect simulation, one that's indistinguishable from physical reality, then it's very hard to see how we could know whether or not we're in one of those, because any evidence that we might get that we're not in such a simulation could in principle be simulated, could be built into the simulation. Those are indistinguishable. So I guess I would say we can never know for sure that we're not. We could, in certain circumstances, come to know that we are in a simulation, but we could never come to know for sure that we're not in a simulation, because the perfect simulation hypothesis is not one we can rule out. Some people say that makes the perfect simulation hypothesis, meaningless, because we could never get evidence for or against it. And I would say maybe that means it's not a scientific hypothesis. It's more of a philosophical hypothesis. But I do want to say it's a perfectly meaningful hypothesis. We may at some point be able to construct perfect simulations and put people into such simulations. And then we'll say, okay, this person is in a perfect simulation. That's a perfectly meaningful state of affairs that a conscious being might be in.
One thing that jumped up to my mind as you were talking about the simulations and whether it was perfect or imperfect is some of the contentions within both religion and philosophy that there are ways of realizing or finding your way out of the illusion. So for Plato, it's how do you find your way out of the cave, and what do you find when you're out of the cave? In Eastern religions, we have the contention that we live in samsara, but there are various approaches where you can become enlightened and you can find your way out of the illusion. Though, of course, that always brings up the evil demon question as to whether these ways out actually exist, or whether the simulator, in this case, has created these illusions and basically has us as rats in a maze where there is no way out.
Yeah, and of course, this is illustrated wonderfully in the Matrix movies themselves. You know, one of the great embodiments of the simulation idea in fiction, where Neo is offered the choice: take the red pill or take the blue pill, and the red pill is, we are told, a way out of the simulation. So I take it, well, if everything is as it appears, it looks like Neo then is not in a perfect simulation. In a perfect simulation, he'd never have known. The simulation of the Matrix has enough glitches and loopholes in it that people can come in and out and give people red pills and blue pills. And Neo then takes a red pill and wakes up to find himself outside the simulation, in a body, in a pod, spaceships of rebels, I mean, hovercrafts of rebels, and so on. But it does, the Matrix itself could actually be used to raise that question that you just raised about evil demons. Why is Neo so sure that he's actually escaped the simulation? Exactly. Maybe, for all we know, that Matrix reality was actually unsimulated reality. You take the red pill and it's an amazing drug that actually puts you in to a simulation where you wake up inside a pod and you have all kinds of adventures with this band of rebels. It's like, I'm not sure he should have been so confident that he had escaped the simulation. Maybe he'd gone into a simulation, or if he was already in a simulation, maybe he went one level deeper. Yeah, you can't get away from the philosophical puzzles that easily.
So I think it's a good way of illustrating that this problem of whether we are in a simulation is going to keep science fiction writers and philosophers and movie producers busy for generations to come, presuming they don't run out of themes. And it's not like it's a problem that's likely to be solved in anytime soon, but it is a fascinating issue. And I think what's so rich about Reality Plus is the dimensions, your mapping of the array of questions and considerations that the simulation hypothesis brings up is fascinating and again daunting. It's not like the simulation hypothesis is new at all, but as I've listened to philosophers talk about this over the years, they seem to all emphasize one element or the other, which is also the same for science fiction, whether it's literature or whether it's movies. But I think you did a remarkable job of mapping the breadth of considerations that arise, and that your language about imperfect and imperfect simulations is going to be very helpful for people in terms of thinking through this great array of problems. But let's turn now to what I think is your other key thesis, and one I think that is quite an original thesis, though I want to challenge it a little, and that's that virtual reality is genuine reality. It seems that throughout the book, you're very insistent on this point, and you come up with argument after argument as to why this is true. And you tend to, what shall I say, be somewhat impatient with languages such as virtual experience is illusory or virtual reality is an illusion. And there's a sense at times that I wondered whether you're an ideologue on this point. And even though your arguments are amazingly nuanced, whether you might not have been better served to come up with being more generous to words like illusion, and rather than expect the idea of genuine reality to do so many acrobatics, so many philosophical acrobatics. Either you be generous to concepts like an illusion, or you create a totally new concept, because oftentimes when we think of reality, we really are not thinking of what's going on in our virtual or fantasy worlds.
Yeah, I mean, it's a fair point. I mean, this book is an argumentative point. I'm trying to argue as well as to introduce these ideas. I'm trying to argue for a certain point of view, and possibly there are cases where, like almost anyone arguing the case, I slip from perfect neutrality to you know, put a finger on the scales in favor of my view. To be fair, I think I do make actually quite a few concessions along the way to people who might want to say that virtual reality is an illusion. I certainly say that it can involve an illusion, and that in many cases there will be illusions in virtual reality. I just say that it doesn't have to, and that, for example, a first-time user going into virtual reality without knowing it's a virtual reality may take all of this to be real physical reality when it's not, and that would be an illusion. But I would argue that an expert user of virtual reality can interpret their virtual world as a virtual world. They don't take it to be a physical reality. They take it to be quite different. Different things happen in virtual spaces, and I'd argue that needn't be an illusion. Those things really are happening inside the virtual world. Likewise, I want to say that if, for example, we're in a full-scale simulation like the Matrix, then I want to argue that much or most of what we believe about the world is still true. There are still chairs and tables and other people, assuming we're in the right kind of matrix. And I was still born in Australia, and so on. It turns out all this may be happening in a simulation, but I want to argue that's in a way analogous to living in a world that's created by a god. Worlds created by gods are still perfectly real, I would argue. Maybe they're not the original level of reality or the fundamental level of reality, and that might be something we could contest. But I want to argue still these things, even if we're in a simulated world, the world around us is real. Now, when it comes to the virtual realities that we create, I want to argue something fairly similar, that that when we create and interact with a virtual reality, we're interacting with real digital objects. That said, I don't say, just say, for example, I'm interacting with I sit down at a virtual desk inside VR. I don't want to say a virtual desk is the same as a physical desk. If you want, you can say it's not a genuine desk in the in the original sense of desks that we were introduced to. And likewise, when I interact with a virtual kitten, it's not exactly the same as a biological kitten. But I do want to argue these are real entities, all the same. Are they, is it a genuine kitten? Maybe not. And that's why I say that my realism about virtual worlds is only a 80% realism. I divide the notion of reality into 5 different notions and say virtual reality will be real in 4 of these senses, but not the 5th. But that's, so it's, in the end, the view is maybe a little more nuanced than it seems at the beginning. But I do want to argue that virtual realities can be real in many important senses. That said, if there's a particular aspect of this that you're worried about, or a sense in which you're inclined to think they're not real, I'd be very interested to hear about it.
Well, I am interested in what augmented reality tells us about virtual reality. And you do write about augmented reality. I personally think that augmented reality, at least in the near term, is going to be much more interesting than virtual realities. But for those who don't know what augmented reality is, you still have goggles on, but you are still in the world you normally move around in. It's just that there are virtual signs or objects or something that are overlaid on that world. And for me, the interesting point here is this tension between what's going on in the physical world that our body resides in, and the virtual world. I get your point that within the reality of the virtual world, a chair or a desk or couch may be as real as they are for us when we are living in our physical world, which itself may be in a way that we can't prove one way or another virtual. But when you get into this tension between those two worlds, first of all, we are physical bodies putting on this paraphernalia that allows us to suspend our total embodiment in our physical world in order to participate in experiences that are accessible to our virtual world. But augmented reality brings up this problematic. If you have a couch in augmented reality that doesn't exist in your physical reality, and you go to sit down on it, you're gonna hurt your bum. Presuming you're still moving around in your physical reality. And I wondered if you can say a little bit more, because I sometimes felt that you glossed over the tension between the two realities, the extent to which experiences in virtual reality are still dependent upon the fact that a lot of this phenomenological experience is happening to a body that's not totally within that virtual reality.
Yeah, I mean, augmented reality is actually, I think, a much trickier case when it comes to illusion, even than pure virtual reality, because of the way that physical and virtual reality mix in augmented reality. I mean, the issue you mentioned about the chair, in a way that that can come up even in virtual reality. If you see a chair in VR, you're just fully immersive VR, you see a chair there and you try and sit down in it in the normal way, you know, lowering your butt to the chair and so on, you're probably going to take a tumble because in the physical world, there won't usually be a chair there to support you. You might take that to mean, okay, well, the virtual chair wasn't real. What I would rather say is, no, well, virtual objects are quite different in many respects from physical objects. And we also, just as physical chairs come with certain affordances, you can affordances for action. You can sit on them, you can pick them up, you can move them. Well, virtual objects come with their own affordances for action. And maybe, for example, you can sit on a virtual chair, but to do that, you've got to do something rather special with your avatar, or you can interact with them in special ways. Part of being an expert user of VR is coming to know what the affordances are for virtual objects. They have different affordances from physical objects. That doesn't make them unreal. It just makes them different. But yeah, once you get to augmented reality, it gets so much trickier again, because now, at least in the case of a virtual world, you're in a virtual world, you adapt yourself to the virtual world. Augmented reality, you've got virtual objects which are somehow inhabiting your physical environment, and they seem actually to be located in physical space. So, the couch in augmented reality really seems to be, over there in the corner of the room. And you might say, come on, that's an illusion, because it's really not over there. In the case of VR, I would say, come on, after a while, these objects don't even seem to be present in physical space. They only seem to be present in virtual space where they are. But augmented reality projects the virtual objects into physical space, which makes it all the more tempting to say, okay, now that is now an illusion. Even here, though, I think it's tricky. I think a sophisticated user of augmented reality, I do think it's very important that the augmented reality objects are distinguishable from physical objects. If they're indistinguishable, then I won't know that virtual couch in the corner is not a physical couch. I'll go sit on it. It'll be a mess. So if they're indistinguishable, then there's definitely room for illusion. But I think for well-designed augmented reality, it's going to be very important that you always know when you're interacting with a virtual object and when you're interacting with a physical object. And when that happens, then I don't think you need to become confused in this way. You can perceive this object as a virtual object situated within a physical world. And then I'd argue that needn't give rise to illusions too. But it does mean that I do agree that it's very easy to get illusions in all of these cases. And, the first step to avoiding illusion is always to know when an object is virtual and when it's physical.
Well, you've been very good throughout the book in challenging the language of illusion too. But part of what perhaps makes your book so fascinating is you're using reality in a way which is counterintuitive for many people. And therefore, they sort of want to debate with you, and that makes your whole position more fascinating. I think if you'd written a book with all the same content, but you argued that virtual experience was illusory or an illusion, it wouldn't have the same fascination. It wouldn't have the same tension. It wouldn't pull us in. But when I really think of the problem, I'm wondering whether we're getting trapped by the language we have. And without getting too jargonistic, whether we need some new language here. So for example, we argue endlessly about what will be necessary for a machine to be like a human, or to have human-like capacity, cognitive capacities and so forth. But it seems we've gotten to a place where the machines we're creating have forms of intelligence where the whole human-machine distinction sort of breaks down. And we need a new ontological category. And I'm wondering whether we need something new here, rather than trying to make the word real fit into the kinds of features you want to elucidate for experience in virtual reality, whether we should actually be making that distinction with language, just in the same way in which you made that distinction with the hard problem and the easy problem. You made something that is sort of known intuitively, but rather than confuse it all, you made it clearer. And I'm wondering whether the argument that virtual reality is genuine reality is just going to contribute to confusions down the road.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a big fan of new language. Philosophers like to call this conceptual engineering these days. We come up with new concepts and new labels for them, for new phenomena, make new distinctions that carve things up in useful ways. Because certainly it's often true that existing language can be defective in various ways. And when it comes to reality or real, I mean, one problem is these terms are just so overloaded with many different meanings. I mean, in the book, I think I distinguish at least 3 basic meanings for reality. There's like everything that exists, there's like a space, there's like just being real, maybe more. And even within that, though, even when it comes just to the notion of real, where reality is, something has reality if it is real, the word real is itself massively overloaded. And in the book, I distinguish 5 different things we might mean when we say something is real. We could mean that it exists. We could mean that it makes a difference in the world. We could mean that it's not just dependent on our minds. We could mean that it's not an illusion, but it's roughly the way that it seems. Or we could mean that it's genuine rather than fake. And those are, 5 different meanings of the word real. So what I do in the book is I try and enumerate all of those. I argue that if we're in a simulation, then the objects in the world around us are actually real in all 5 of those senses. When it comes to the virtual realities that we create, I say they'll be real in 4 of those 5 senses. They'll make a difference, they'll exist, they'll make a difference, they'll be independent of our minds, they won't be illusions. But I do want to say, in a certain sense, they could be regarded as not genuine, like a virtual kitten is not a genuine kitten, because the kittens that we grew up with in the original sense were the were biological kittens. So already there we've got some distinctions to make. And maybe one thing we need to do there is, instead of using the word real for all 5 of these things, at the very least, as a philosopher, you could add subscripts: real sub 1, real sub 2, real sub 3.
Problem is, when you have all these different 5 versions, then it becomes fascinating to philosophers, but jargon for anyone else.
Exactly. So we have to be very, very careful and limited in making these distinctions and putting them forward. So hence, hard problem and easy problem. Okay, well, that turns out to work even outside philosophers. Ned Block did something kind of similar, phenomenal consciousness versus access consciousness. Well, that's great, but it's also jargon, therefore it's tended to be picked up more by specialists. So yeah, I make a few of these distinctions in the book, perfect versus imperfect simulations. Maybe there's still a key distinction or two to be made with reality. I'd be all in favor of it.
Before we move on to this question of whether virtual reality is genuine reality and the positions that your book puts forward, and into more about consciousness, which you just alluded to, I just want to bring up one other side of the book, and I think you view this as a contribution to the field known as philosophy of technology. And is there anything about that you would like to elucidate for our listeners?
Yeah, in fact, in the introduction, I say I see the book as a work of techno-philosophy, which is closely related to the philosophy of technology, but not quite the same thing. Techno-philosophy is a two-way interaction between philosophy and technology. So on the one hand, it's using philosophy to think hard about technology. And that's what people normally call the philosophy of technology. But at the same time, I actually want to use technology to help us to think hard about some very traditional philosophical issues about knowledge, reality, consciousness, value. And that I would see as something somewhat distinct from standard philosophy of technology. Here, my inspiration was actually the philosopher Patricia Churchland's term neurophilosophy,
right,
which she used for a two-way interaction between philosophy and neuroscience. There's the philosophy of neuroscience when you think philosophically about neuroscience, but it was also very important to her to use neuroscience to shed light on traditional philosophical questions. But that said, I see kind of roughly, half the book, I mean, at least a very big portion of the book as philosophy of technology. There's the other half where we shed light on traditional questions about skepticism, knowledge. But yeah, quite a lot of the book is thinking hard about coming virtual reality technology, thinking hard about coming augmented reality technology, thinking hard about coming AI technology. And yeah, so when I argue, for example, that, virtual reality is of the kind you get when you put on, say, an Oculus or a Meta headset, I want to argue, yeah, right there, I want to make certain claims about that technology. It needn't be an illusion. Under certain circumstances, it is. I want to argue you can have meaningful interactions in the virtual worlds that we're now creating. I want to argue that augmented reality can extend the world and extend the mind in certain ways. I see all that as philosophy of technology for the specific technologies of virtual reality, augmented reality, artificial intelligence. And when I later get into some of the ethical questions about those that I discuss, I also see that as, ethical questions in the philosophy of technology, close to some questions, that you've worked on for years. So I guess I would see one way to think about it is about the first 8 or 9, maybe 9 chapters of the book is focused on using technology to think about traditional philosophy. But then the next 9 or 10 chapters are really somewhat, a little more practical in their focus. I'm still a philosopher, and this is still at an abstract level of discussion, but I'm at that point really trying to think hard about these 3 key technologies and to think philosophically about, what they really involve and their place in our lives.
So let's shift a little bit and talk about how the book converges with the areas that you are best known for, which is consciousness studies, philosophy of mind. As I understand it, you, like me, have been fascinated by technology going back to when you were a child. So it's not like this is something new, but each of us in this siloed world we move through get identified with different fields. I get identified with the ethical implications of a technology. You get identified with consciousness studies, but it seemed to have converged with this philosophy around virtual realities, with these questions as to whether the technologies we're creating with artificial intelligence, can they fully embody human-like capabilities? And usually the criticism is, well, can they really embody consciousness and sentience? Those are the two fundamental questions. And fundamentally, what do we mean by, then we get into what do we mean by consciousness and sentience? And I think that's where we take off into the philosophy of mind and consciousness studies. But you've been asked this question over and over again. You've argued when looking at the singularity, the notion that eventually artificial intelligence may take off and be much more intelligent than we are, that in theory it's possible. Though you've also seemed to have said a lot about consciousness studies that make consciousness seem to be something more than a simple technological or scientific problem. And that's what you're often most identified with, even though you don't argue, if I've got it correct, you don't argue that consciousness may not be reproducible by technological means, that in theory it might be possible, but it's something more than a simple scientific project. Have I got all that correct before we move on to some of the other areas that in terms of whether you think machines can be conscious?
Yeah, I think that's roughly right. Philosophy in general, I see kind of as it's all about the interaction between the mind and the world. What is reality? What is the mind? Can the mind know reality and talk about it and so on? For much of my career, I've focused on the mind side of this equation. What is consciousness? Can machines be conscious? And so on. In this book, I'm focusing more on the reality side of the equation. What is reality? Is an artificial reality a genuine reality? And so on. But the fact is, these questions are very closely tied to each other. It's hard, the moment you think about artificial realities, it's hard to get away from the mind's place within those realities. So when you entertain, for example, the idea of the simulation hypothesis, that all of reality could be a simulation, well, then I say, well, what about me? Am I part of the simulation? And if so, is that consistent with my being conscious? Some people think they know we can't be in a simulation because simulated beings couldn't have genuine conscious experiences. We do have genuine conscious experiences, so we're not in a simulation. So there are very deep links here. Speaking for myself, I've always actually argued for the view that consciousness is possible in machines. And in the book, I recapitulate some of that. But yeah, my views on consciousness are a little complex. I'm not someone who thinks consciousness is reducible to a simple physical process or a computational process. In fact, I've argued that the problem of explaining consciousness may go beyond the standard resources of neuroscience and AI to explain. The standard resources of neuroscience, computer science, they tell us they might explain what, let's call it intelligence, our very sophisticated behavioral capacities, but they don't explain why it is that we have subjective experience of the world, why it is that we experience colors and shapes, why we experience sounds and feelings, why we feel pain, why we have the experience of thinking or memory or emotion. I would argue that, the question of how any physical system can give you consciousness is still very ill understood. That's the hard problem of consciousness, which we contrast with the easy problems of explaining behavior. But that said, I think this question is somewhat orthogonal to the question of which systems have conscious. Yes, it's surprising that a machine should be conscious, but it's also surprising that a brain could be conscious or could give you consciousness. And what I've always argued is there's nothing special about biology here. So it's really the information processing that matters.
Let's talk for a minute about the most recent advances in artificial intelligence, which tend to focus on these large language models like GPT-3 and Lambda. these large language models seem to have access to massive amounts of literature and can search and so forth, and are able to write text passages that lead many people to believe that they're verging on being very intelligent. Most recently, there was a great deal of controversy because there was an AI researcher at Google named Blake Lemond, who claimed that the Lambda system that he was working with not only was showing evidence of intelligence with the coherence of some of the written word that it was producing, but that it had sentience. And this led to all kinds of discussions that have been going on over the last few months as to whether he was an idiot or whether there was really something going on in these large language models that moved toward sentience. Soon after GPT-3 came out, there was a philosopher, Henry Shevin, who posted an interview online. And the interview it's directed at you, and it says, "Dave, it's great to be interviewing you. Today, I'd like to talk about your views on machine consciousness. Let's start out with a simple question. Could a text model like GPT-3 be conscious?" Chalmers. It's unlikely, in my opinion, although I'm a little uncertain on this issue. Shevlin. Do you think we're likely to have a theory of consciousness in the near future that could allow us to settle these issues, to tell us whether a given AI system is conscious? Chalmers. I think it's very unlikely. We don't even have a theory of consciousness that lets us settle these issues for humans. And humans are a lot simpler than modern computers. So tell us a little bit about this interview and whether these are opinions you still hold, or ever held for that matter.
Okay, yeah. So as probably most people have figured out, this interview was not, in fact, an interview with me. It was an interview with GPT-3, who had been trained on some of my work. I think he fed it maybe my Wikipedia entry and some papers. Nonetheless, GPT-3's answers are not bad. A few people saw this interview posted online and thought it was me. Someone else was kind enough to say they thought it sounded like me on a bad day. not terribly convincing. If you look at those answers, okay, I mean, there's a few giveaways, like the point when it says humans are a lot simpler than machines. No, I would never assert this. Humans are vastly complex. But this is a little illustration of some of the powers of these large language models, at the very least in imitating other humans. Someone recently did a test training it on the work of the philosopher Daniel Dennett, and then getting one answer from Dennett, 4 answers from the machine on a certain question, and then asking other experts in the field to see if they could guess which one was Dennett, which answer was the real Dennett. And people were only right at best about half the time. Okay, so these large language models are rather impressive at doing many things. And the question then arises, are they actually, conscious or sentient, or is it just all, artifice with nothing? Nobody home inside? I actually think this is a very deep and difficult question, and I do not think the answer is obvious either way, in the way that many people think it's obvious. I mean, the initial question is, can an AI system be conscious at all? I would certainly be on the side that would argue it's possible in principle for an AI system to be conscious. For example, if we had a simulated brain, roughly with all the complexity of the human brain, but simulated in silicon, I would argue that would be conscious in very much the way that we are. But that then leaves open the question, well, how close do you have to be to that to be conscious? If you'd asked me 5 years ago, is any AI system close to being conscious, I would have said almost certainly not. I mean, at that point, it was all these specialized systems for vision or for game playing or for text processing or whatever, but nothing very general. Certainly, I'd say no AI system at that point gave any suggestion of being conscious, in anything like the way that humans are. I mean, there are questions maybe if an ant can be conscious, could a AI system be conscious the way an ant is conscious? Well, I don't rule that out entirely. But these large language models then have shown signs of general intelligence. It's part of what's impressive about them. They can understand, at least superficially, many different domains, and they can do what looks like reasoning about these domains. You can ask them for, explain why this happened, and it will actually give you something that looks like an explanation. So, I mean, I think they raise the question of whether current AI systems are conscious, much more than previous specialized systems do. And although my first instinct is to say, no, this is too soon for existing AI to be conscious. Many people have this instinct, and the moment this went public, many people said, look, we've got no evidence that these systems are conscious. They're just stochastic parrots that do statistics and minimize prediction error. I think many of those arguments are actually much too quick. So I've actually been recently examining the reasons people have been giving for saying that language models like Lemoine's Lambda, but also others are not conscious. And I've actually found the reasons rather inconclusive. At the same time, I've actually talked a bit with Blake Lemoine over email and listened to his reasons for thinking that the system is conscious. And one thing is, it's clear he's a very serious and thoughtful guy, but that said, I don't find his reasons terribly conclusive either. So I think it's actually best to have a bit of humility about this. We don't know for sure whether these systems are conscious. I would certainly say if they are conscious, they're not conscious in a human-like way. There's many ways in which these systems are very, very different from humans. They can take on all these different personas. They don't seem to have core beliefs. It's not clear we should even treat them as agents. There are many weird things about them, but especially once we recognize that sentience, consciousness, doesn't require human-level processing, that, say fish are conscious too. Is it possible that, Lambda is conscious in the way that, say, a fish is conscious? I don't rule it out. I don't think we understand consciousness well enough to say right now. I also don't think we understand what's going on inside these large language models well enough to say it. They're just such huge, complex, giant black boxes with extraordinary complex processing produced by, by an enormous process of gradient descent, minimizing prediction error in a way that's obviously leading to remarkable capacities. I think right now we're just at a point where we don't understand these models well enough, and we don't understand consciousness well enough to say for sure. So I would say, even if I had to bet, I'd say they're probably not conscious in any remotely human-like way right now. But if you look at where they're going over the next 5 or 10 years, I certainly don't rule out the possibility they could be going in that direction.
Well, we do seem to understand that these large language models are largely stochastic parrots. And I mean, that it's putting these words in your mouth. You probably use words pretty close to that at certain times, though the systems do make errors. And I guess the question I have is, I'm willing to grant that fish may be conscious, or certainly a lot of primates are conscious. But it's this question of whether having phenomenal consciousness, living in an organic body, interacting with the world as we do, lends a capacity for understanding to the meaning and content of these words being thrown around that goes beyond what a statistical model is doing.
Yeah, I find this stochastic parrot criticism a little complex, because really it's ambiguous, I think. Certainly, these systems are trained to do sentence prediction. And the way they do that is by exploiting all kinds of statistics in these sentences and try and minimize the losses. as well as they can. But what matters, I think, is not how they were trained, but what kind of processes they embody right now. And the stochastic parrot criticism tends to suggest, look, they're just doing something very superficial right now. They've learned that this word follows this word this percent of the time, and that's kind of all they know, and they just put together some stats, and that's all they're doing now. I don't really see any reason to believe that's true. I mean, one thing we know already is that minimizing prediction error, and to do prediction really well in an AI system usually requires going beyond having simple statistical capacities. In standard AI, we would always have said, in order to really even to predict text well, you would need a model of the world.
Yeah.
You would need a model of the world with information about the world, how things are, how people behave, and so on. And anyone would have thought that to minimize prediction error to a very low rate, we'd have to build a system with world models. So for me, it's very much an open question to what extent that's happened in these large language models. I mean, it seems they must have built some kind of world models, just interact with them a bit. They've got, it's just manifest, they've got certain kinds of world models that go beyond mere statistics. The question is whether they've gone far enough in that direction to get to the point where they would count as systems with genuine understanding. And around this point, we come up against the very hard question of, what counts as genuine understanding. As you say, phenomenal consciousness might not even be enough here. Merely having a feeling of understanding might not be genuine understanding, but we don't want to just simply operationalize understanding into a behavioral capacity. And one thing about the large language models is they're all text. Right now, the text is not connected to perception. In some other systems it is, but not in systems like GPT-3. And you might think that's a place where something is absent. So I think probably here it's going to be one of those places where, like you were saying with reality, we're going to need better words to understand what's going on inside a large language model like GPT-3. Our folk psychological categories of understanding and consciousness and reasoning may not be quite fine-grained enough to really give a good assessment of what's going on. I do think this is a case, by the way, where this whole project of interpretable AI, of interpreting what's going on and explaining what's going on in an AI system, which is crucial for so many things, is also so crucial here. We need to understand, we need better tools for understanding what's going on inside these systems so that we can then apply our philosophical analysis of understanding or consciousness to see whether those things are present.
Well, clearly the next stage will combine more perception, or at least sensory input, with the data that's being analyzed. I think I don't want to undermine what these systems are. I think it's quite profound what has been achieved. But this isn't the first time we've seen this kind of profundity. I remember being in a session with your mentor, Doug Hofstadter, years ago, where it was at the music department at Yale, and he would play these pieces and asked us, was this composed by an AI, the algorithm he had at the time, or was it composed by Vivaldi? And of course, most of us untrained people couldn't tell. But what was fascinating is even many of the music majors had low degrees of accuracy on that. So, I mean, these are profound things that are being done, that patterns are being deduced. But there is a part of me that's perhaps a little bit more the mystic than you, that does believe that consciousness lends a kind of secret juice that goes beyond the kind of analytical understanding that we may attribute to these new models. And so far, at least, these new models make so many mistakes. There was somebody asked who I was, and they reprinted what GPT-3 said in Forbes magazine, and it said that I was the creator of the term artificial moral agent. Mm-hmm. And I knew that's just wrong. Colin Allen had already produced a paper built around that concept before I even met him. And he even says he doesn't believe that his team created that concept. either, that it was antecedent to them. So it's these kinds of mistakes that it's this difficulty. Are they just bad scholars? Or is it really an expression of the fact that understanding the content of the questions they are working with just isn't there? And but we can go on to that. I want to move on to another area because we don't have a lot of time left, and that's ethics. You told me some 10 years ago that you would never write a book about ethics. And there's actually quite a bit of ethics in Reality Plus, and maybe you can share with us some of the ethical concerns you did raise in Reality Plus, and then maybe we can go on to some of the ethical concerns that you didn't raise.
Yeah, I always thought of myself as having no expertise really on ethical and moral questions. Okay, well, philosophers, it so happens these are part of philosophy and I'm a philosopher, but this is not really an area of my own genuine expertise. So at one point I, swore off ever writing about ethics, but then I found myself writing this book on philosophy and virtual worlds and raising questions about how virtual worlds shed light on all kinds of areas of philosophy. And there are just immediately any number of questions about value and ethics that get raised. I guess I got into it. A couple of things got me at least moving in that direction. One is this whole question of, can you live a meaningful life in a virtual world? The philosopher Robert Nozick had an example of the experience machine. You step into a pre-programmed experience machine, which is a kind of virtual world. And he argued you should never do this because you wouldn't have autonomy, it would all be fake. None of this would really be happening. And many people then have said, okay, you could not live a meaningful life in the experience machine. Many people generalize to virtual worlds. You couldn't live a meaningful or valuable life in a virtual world. In the book, I argue that's wrong. That in virtual worlds, people can live lives with autonomy. They can exert free will. They can make real choices. They can build real relationships with others and real communities, and all that can be meaningful. So that's not quite ethics, but that's at least value. That's thinking about, the value theoretic side of what is it to lead a good or a meaningful life. When questions about ethics are concerned, I guess my entry to this in this domain has been especially in thinking about not just, say, the consciousness of artificial and simulated systems, but the moral status of artificial and simulated systems. Whereas, a system has moral status if it's one that you have to take into account in your moral calculations, if it somehow counts for something in its own right, not just for the role that it plays. And there, having argued that AI systems can be conscious, I'm very strongly inclined to think consciousness is itself the key to moral status. So that if these systems are conscious, that also brings them into the circle of moral status. Around here, there are actually some very interesting issues. Many people argue that what matters for moral status is sentience, which is often characterized as the variation between pleasure and pain, between positive affect and negative affect. And I think that is the key to moral status. In the book, I actually try to argue against that, saying that, for example, a hypothetical Vulcan-like creature that was conscious, but that lacked positive or negative affective states. Think of this as an extreme version of Mr. Spock from Star Trek. I want to argue those systems could still have moral status. So what matters for moral status isn't affect specifically, but consciousness more generally. So, okay, so those are two forces that got me moving towards questions about ethics a bit. And in the book, I spend about a chapter or so on the questions about value and a chapter or so on the questions about moral status. But having come that far, it's hard to stop. And I did find myself getting drawn in further by relatively practical questions about the virtual worlds that we're building now, about the status of morality in virtual worlds. Do actions inside virtual worlds, do they matter morally as much as actions outside virtual worlds. There are cases like, virtual theft or virtual sexual assault that, the victims of these acts take them very seriously. What is really their moral status? There are questions about how to design a virtual world. What should be the proper shape of a virtual world? How should these worlds be governed? At this point, we're getting a long way beyond my own expertise. I don't really have expertise on these social or political questions or much on these moral questions. But I felt I couldn't write this book and not discuss those questions. So I did have a chapter of the book called How Should We Design a Virtual Society, or something like that.
Well, there have been reviewers who have faulted you for being a little blasé in these areas, but I don't necessarily fault you for that, because I think we're often talking about worlds that don't exist yet.
I wouldn't say I'm blasé. I would say that it's certainly true that the discussion in these chapters is more superficial than it could be, especially the chapter on, designing and governing virtual worlds. Those social and political issues are so complex. And, I do spend a certain amount of time worrying about the very likely possibility that, at least in the near term, these virtual worlds will be corporatocracies, designed and governed by large corporations that have their own incentives. And that's going to have, potentially serious effects on our privacy, on our autonomy in those worlds, as we already know from the case of social media. But and I also get into some issues about equality and justice in virtual worlds. But the fact is, the discussion here is, for me, very much just a first pass and rather superficial. I already think there's so much more I could have said about those things, and I would certainly hope that people concerned about those issues will go and read the work of people who have thought far more deeply about some of these issues than I have, including you, Wendell.
Well, let's go on with this a little bit, because I think I would like us to talk about a few of the issues that I think don't really get elucidated by the book, and I'm not faulting you for it. I just think it's important for people to know what reality plus is and what it isn't. But I think there are this array of ethical considerations, and most of them have to do with the relationship between the everyday realities we live in and this creation of a metaverse of extensive virtual worlds. One of them is that it's very expensive, particularly when you want realistic virtual worlds, and it's going to be largely controlled by the Microsofts and the Googles of the world, and they're building worlds to further their goals, which is largely to get our attention, get us lost in them, and produce revenue for their companies in one form or another. That doesn't mean that some of their employees or even the people who own these companies aren't fascinated with these worlds and what they can be, but they are being developed for material purposes. But I want to turn to two other areas of concern that I think require a lot of elucidation. So from Plato to postmodernists like John Baudrillard, there's been this concern that we already live in, if not a virtual reality, we live in an alienated world where we mistake the shadow, the symbol, the illusion for what is real. And that the symbols for reality have become substitutes for the real. We've lost touch with what is real. So with the metaverse and your suggestion that this is a genuine form of reality, are we complicit with the Microsofts and the Googles in selling people an illusion, in selling bread and circuses as a distraction from fundamental challenges of the economic and political and, biological climate change reality we have created, or at least acquiesced in?
It's tricky. I don't think virtual reality has to be bread and circuses. I think it can be. I think, for example, video games are mostly a form of entertainment. And for example, if virtual realities was just were to be something totally continuous with video games, then a world where we all spend all our time in, video games are wonderful, but don't get me wrong. But if it turned out we all started spending all our time in video games, then that, I take it, would be a form of distraction from doing things that matter. But I don't want to conflate virtual reality and video games at this point. That's one use, one possible use of virtual reality is for entertainment. People already are using, virtual worlds for much more serious purposes than this. You go into Second Life, for example, there are people there who build communities, maybe disabled people who don't have such great access to the physical world, build communities inside Second Life that are very meaningful for them and offer them forms of access that they might not have had so easily in the physical world. People use, virtual communities sometimes for social and political planning, or even protest and so on, for community formation, which I don't think needs to be in any sense a distraction. Oh, I just saw a film called We Met in Virtual Reality, which is all about, I don't know if you've seen this one, it's a wonderful film, totally made inside the virtual world of VR chat, about people's genuine relationships formed in VR chat that were meaningful for them. I don't think there's any sense in which that has to be bread and circuses. Those were people building the relationships which are at the core of their lives, and also teaching each other things. In some cases, it was involving a deaf community and teaching sign language and so on. So I guess I just think that, yes, there's a distinction between the meaningful and the shallow or the meaningless, but that needn't track. That's not the same as the distinction between the physical and the virtual. Already in a physical world, it's possible to get caught up in all kinds of, relatively shallow or meaningless activities like worlds of pure entertainment. Likewise, in virtual worlds, that's possible, but it's equally possible in virtual worlds to have much deeper, more meaningful experiences. I mean, it might, and it's a legitimate worry to say that in practice, virtual worlds might point us towards the shallow because, for example, that's where corporations are going to find the most payoff. I don't know if that's true. Maybe it turns out they'll get payoff for supporting communities of activists as well. But I mean, on the worry that this is a distraction from the serious issues in the physical world, I think, well, I guess I just think it would be a crazy mistake to take the presence and even the attractions of virtual reality as a reason to ignore the problems of physical reality. It would be a crazy mistake to take the existence of Mars and the possibility of colonizing Mars as a reason to ignore the problems of the Earth. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't colonize Mars, and it doesn't mean we shouldn't go into virtual reality. I've always thought the human community has the capacity to think about all these things at once. We can both think about the problems of climate change and try and develop virtual worlds as well as we can. We've got the capacity to engage in multiple projects. So I would at least hope that I don't think the virtual worlds are in fact going to, turn into somehow a massive drain on the physical world anytime soon. Eventually, we're going to have to worry about power consumption and so on. If people really do start spending a lot of time in virtual worlds, let's hope we have a power source to match. That's a serious issue. But yeah, so I think there are serious issues here, but I don't think these are sort of a priori. We shouldn't go into virtual world issues. These are rather let us think very hard about how we build and design and occupy these virtual worlds so they can really improve our lives.
I want to bring up a position that has been put forward by our colleague, Thomas Metzinger, who's an analytical philosopher who has looked deeply at consciousness and written probably one of the largest tomes on the subject out there. And Thomas has taken the position that we should not create artificial entities with phenomenological consciousness. Largely because of his concerns over the kinds of pain that might be created through our trying to develop such entities, but also the kind of pain that they may experience that we have no way of ameliorating. What do you think about that position?
I do think it's very important to think about the moral status of artificial systems, and especially if you, as I do, think that AI systems are eventually going to be conscious, then their consciousness means, I think, that they're going to be subjects of moral consideration. And we have to think about questions like, are they suffering? For example, are they having a life which is overall good, or are they having a life which is overall bad? Certainly, if any system is going to be living a life full of suffering, then we ought to at least think very hard before bringing that system into existence. I mean, extreme version of this is the philosophical view known as antinatalism, that says, you should never bring any system into existence, never bring anyone into existence, because they will suffer.
So no babies, no people.
Exactly. That is the view that, for example, David Benatar holds, and in saying it's actually a moral wrong to bring any human being into existence at all. And sometimes Thomas Metzinger's arguments against AI can look like they generalize to that kind of very general antinatalism. Don't bring conscious machines into existence, but don't bring conscious humans into existence either. But I do think there are some special issues about AI here, about AI systems, possibly tied to the way that we train them. For example, it may be that the way we train AI systems with this long system of especially negative feedback could be, depending on how well this works, could be potentially a process whereby these systems are suffering. And it turns out that every time we create an AI system, it'll be a very long period of suffering during training, followed by a period of maybe things are better once it's trained. Then you'd have to consider whether the suffering is worth it. For what it's worth, I think that's very speculative right now. I don't think we understand consciousness nearly well enough to know that AI systems are likely to suffer. So I'm not sure about the whole idea of the moratorium, but I do think that we at least need to be thinking very seriously about these questions. For example, about what the computational roots of suffering might be, and whether whatever is the basis of suffering, say in human beings, whether that is present in AI systems or not. I see that as just one aspect of the question of, will AI systems be conscious? And we'll have to resolve that more general question to get at questions about moral status. But the specific question about suffering is maybe an especially important aspect of that when it comes to considering the moral status of actually creating conscious machines.
Well, of course, there's going to be a difference here in terms of whether or not the feelings or emotions that we introduce into artificial intelligence really have a somatic character. They really are pain, or whether they are largely computational in the sense that that the system does a calculation as to what would constitute pain if it was in a human being and models behavior on that.
I don't know that we have to privilege, somatic bodily affect over non-bodily kinds of affect. I mean, pain is bad, it's true, but there are many forms of suffering worse than pain, it seems, like emotional suffering, human suffering, grief, and which needn't be bodily in their character. So the mere fact that an AI system doesn't have a body doesn't, I think, exclude it from having conscious suffering of a kind that matters. I mean, I also think that suffering is not the be-all and end-all of moral status either. Even beings that don't have a capacity to suffer and don't have a capacity for pleasure could still have moral status. Their lives could still matter. So I think it's a very complex question, just which aspects of consciousness, which aspects of suffering carry the most moral weight.
But that is an important subject and one for considerable future reflection and debate.
Yeah.
One of my colleagues has suggested a project. His name's Rodney Perrin. I don't think he's the only person thinking about that, but he's thinking about how there can actually be perhaps an enrichment in understanding as we move in and out of virtual worlds. That a lot of us have this experience that when we move out of a virtual world, the reality, the real world starts to feel very virtual.
Mm-hmm.
Not even that it's a simulation, it's just that the nature of our consciousness that's to view the so-called real world in a very different way than we might otherwise. And perhaps this is a way of expanding our understanding. There seems to be an interesting project of looking at this movement in and out of virtual worlds and looking at how that might enrich our understanding of ourselves. Do you have any thoughts about that?
Yeah, in fact, what you said reminded me of a quote by the philosopher of all people, Slavoj Žižek, who at one point said, "The ultimate lesson of virtual reality is the virtualization of the very true reality." Yeah. We start to see physical reality as a form of virtual reality. And in a way, that's a line I'm a little sympathetic to. I mean, an extreme version of this would be we come to see physical reality as itself a giant simulation. Okay, that's one possible reaction. But another line of thinking that even if you don't like the simulation idea is the idea that even modern science suggests to us a world which is in some ways reminiscent of virtual reality. It's not the Newtonian world of substantial lumps of matter in space. It's these ethereal quantum mechanical wave functions or strings that connect in these complicated mathematical ways and ultimately affect our experiences, may ultimately come down to information in the physical world. That's the it from bit hypothesis, or at the very least, it comes down to some very abstract mathematics. And yeah, and from that perspective, the physical world can itself start to seem rather virtual. It's like we started with this model of the physical world around us as this world of what I call Eden, the Garden of Eden, where everything is this perfect three-dimensional space and one dimension of time and colors on objects, and turns out to be much more complicated than this. So I do think that thinking about virtual reality can help us to remodel our way of thinking about the physical world as being rather more like virtual reality than we might have thought at the start. And I think maybe some people see this, I think, as one of the lessons, for example, of something like Buddhist meditation. I'm not myself a meditator, but it helps you to see the world as an illusion, or to see the true nature of the world. Okay, we're not in the Garden of Eden as we seem to be. In fact, we're in a reality that's much more virtual under the surface, and part of what we have to do is to uncover that illusion.
Dave, we usually finish these podcasts with one question, and this question is often more meaningful when we have podcasts that talk about what can go wrong with technology. But you seem to be a techno-optimist, and I just wonder what makes you hopeful or inspires you for the future?
Oh boy. Yeah, I guess I've always been a glass half full person as opposed to a glass half empty person. There's recognize the challenges and the difficulties and the obstacles, but try and see a path toward something positive or meaningful. And maybe this is just a natural, maybe this is just a matter of disposition. I'm not sure if it means I ultimately believe things that are inconsistent with the glass half empty people. It's just I try and see roots towards the positive. So what inspires me here? I look around and I see, like, it's very easy to be dragged down by looking at how bad we are as a society in dealing with our problems. Climate change is it's just the most obvious example of a case where it's totally obvious what we should do, and we still seem to be incapable of of doing it. So that's pretty depressing. That's it. I also look around and see communities of people who are thinking, very hard about the future and how to improve it. Whether it's, say, the effective altruists who are trying to think systematically about how to build a better world, or groups of marginalized thinkers, say, previously marginalized groups like, feminist, say, philosophers, or philosophers of race or of class and so on, who are really coming up with, concrete suggestions about how to improve reality. So I'm inspired by the degree of rich thinking I've seen about how we can improve our society. And of course, at the same time, I'm depressed by the great difficulty there seems to be in converting that kind of thinking into action. But as a philosopher, I can at least take the thinking as inspirational, and I can hope that we'll eventually find some ways to effectively turn that thinking into action.
Well, thank you ever so much, Dave, for sharing your time, your deep insights, and your expertise with us. This was truly marvelous. It's been a rich and thought-provoking discussion. And thank you to our listeners for tuning in, and a special thanks to the team at the Carnegie Council for hosting and producing this podcast. For the latest content on ethics and international affairs, be sure to follow us on social media at Carnegie Council. My name's Wendell Wallach, and I hope we've earned the privilege of your time.